Okay, the recording has begun. So we're doing Genesis 32 today. Which, as I said last week, has I think this is probably my favorite story in probably the entire Bible. Um, uh, I, what? Well, no, because in this, and like, so the way that I worded it last week was I said that because so it's like picking the crucifixion as your favorite story in the Bible is like picking Jesus. It's like picking the Bible as your favorite book. It's like you're cheating. It's like you don't actually know anything about it. You're just picking it because everybody says that and you think it's the right answer. And it's like, yeah. And so it was like, no, but
you have a boyfriend. Yeah, I'm dating Jesus. Okay. You're not.
Right, exactly. And so like
Jesus is cheating on you with 8 billion people.
We won't talk about that today. But so like what I said last week was that I think that from the standpoint of like Genesis and the Old Testament, the story of the binding of Isaac is probably one of the most significant stories in relationship to humanity as a whole. But I think that this story is the most significant to like all of us as individuals, which is kind of you can see where there's overlap there, but there's distinct difference about how communities of people relate to God versus how individuals relate to God. And yes, ultimately, like with all things, that's going to have its ultimate fulfillment in Christ. And so part of why I can cheat for this is because Christ kind of shows up in this story, right? And so we'll get into that later. But where we're coming from, Jacob has fleed Laban. He's coming out of his time of exile. He's just like established this covenant that is separating him from like that portion of the family, and he is returning into the land. And so we should really be reading kind of everything in this chapter through that overall lens of returning to the land and coming out of exile. And what we're going to find is that there's this running theme of, so even starting from Genesis, right? We've had this running theme of unity and continuous falls that bring about more and more division, right? And we've had divisions of God and man, between brothers, between brothers, between different family lines, between different clans within those families, between different nations. And we just came out of a story about between different sisters, right? So you have all of these different divisions. And what's going to happen is that it's not going to get concluded in this chapter. We're going to end up talking about it a bunch next week because the conclusion really kind of comes next week. But all of those divisions are going to get highlighted, and then at the end, it's going to start that process of bringing all of those things back together. And I might not, like I said, whenever we talked about the binding of Isaac, I'm not going to be able to say everything that I think a person should say or could say about these stories, but we're going to try and hit it the best that I can. So here we go.
Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim.
All right.
When he said that, made it sound like he just realized it's a camp instead of like a something else. This is God's camp.
This is God's camp, right?
I thought this was his...
Okay, so
Yeah.
this little part is so funny because no one ever really like talks about it with this story. But this little short paragraph is like the framing of basically everything that I just said. If you have like your step Bible open and you click on Mahanaim or whatever, what does it say? What's the definition of it?
Oh, Mahanaim.
Yeah. Mahalani.
What'd you prove there?
But I don't know what the stat Bible.
Yeah, it's a 2 camp.
Says the same thing. So good job, Nate.
Thank you.
Yeah. So 2 camps, right? And so what's happening? Jacob is on his way, and the angels of God, right? If you click on angels, right, it's the like Malak of God, the Malak Elohim. I don't know if I'm saying that word right, so sue me. They come out to meet Jacob. What are they doing? We don't really know. But Jacob sees this going on, right? And he calls that place 2 camps. Why is it called 2 camps? Well, because Jacob is going to make a camp here, and then there's God's camp. And so we have this same thing about like, right, this is mirroring what happened remember when Jacob was going out, he saw this Jacob's ladder vision thing, and it was a vision that was kind of superimposed over reality. So it's the same thing going on here, where he has this vision of God's camp being superimposed onto his camp. Okay. And that 2 camps idea is going to get played with throughout this story. Okay.
And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir.
Okay. And if you click on the word messengers there, it's the word like malak, which is the same word for angels, right? So you have this thing going on where from this camp, God is sending out his angels, and then Jacob mirrors what God does and sends out his angels, right? Which are his messengers.
The country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 camps, thinking, "If Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape."
Okay. So place is called 2 camps. We just have the rationale for Jacob comes up with this plan for he's going to split himself into 2 camps. Okay. And as you're going to see, he says that he's splitting himself into 2 camps, but he's going to continue. There's going to be more divisions that show up. So one of the questions that I want to ask is kind of, why did Jacob send messengers to Esau? Right? Like, Esau apparently didn't really even know about him. Esau knows that he's there because Jacob sends messengers to him. We don't really have any like explanation for this, but I think that it's probable that Jacob sent out his messengers because somehow he's connecting his ideas with his messengers, with God sending out his messengers, and him probably thinking, this is an okay thing for me to do. This is the thing that I should do. Also, you have to kind of wonder, are the messengers that are going to Esau, are those the same? Is Esau with Isaac? Could he have sent them different? Right? He's in Edom, which should be a different area. So you would think like, okay, well, just
I think
You're
he's just testing the waters to see if it's safe.
right.
That's what I
You,
assume.
you have that, right? And yes, I think that he is testing the waters. But so one of the things that I want to highlight here that I think is going on in this story is there's a mapping on of, in the same way that you have this angelic camp that kind of maps on to Jacob's camp, you have a mapping on of Esau to God. And in a lot of the ways that Jacob is going to treat Esau in this story, it is like how a person treats God, especially at that time, and the way that people treated God at that time. And you're gonna get more language of this that's clearer in the next chapter, but where you'll have where he like, I'm pretty sure he straight up says, he's like, your face is like the face of God to me, right? Like, kind of thing, whenever he like finally sees him. But there should be this mapping on of how Jacob is treating Esau is like how people at the time treated gods. Okay. All right. Well, so yeah, I need to make sure that I don't forget to say these. That's why I have them written down. The other thing is that in addition to testing the waters, Jacob is probably trying to let Esau know that he's not there to like take things from him, right? Because Jacob has a reputation with Esau for taking things from him, right? Namely his blessing and his birthright. And that's going to come up again later. But he's sending this message. It's like, hey, I have oxen, donkeys, and all this stuff. And he's even going to like offer them to Esau, but it's like, I don't need to take anything from you. I'm just trying to come home. Okay. All right.
And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my...
Okay. Yeah, I'm already realizing that I forgot stuff. Okay. So I'm just gonna read what I have written here. So Jacob, so it's the fear of Esau. It's the fear of Esau is causing division in Jacob. He doesn't understand what Esau's strength means, right? He sends out these messengers. Esau is coming back to him with 400 men, right? That's a display of Esau's strength. He doesn't understand what Esau's strength means. Is he going to attack Jacob or is he going to help him? So he has a fear of Esau right now. Not understanding Esau's character here is what is causing the issue, right? And so in the same way of the mapping onto of Esau with God, people not understanding God's character is what causes people to have issues with God. They get one of the things that one of the ideas that I've been working on lately in is people's theology is how they live their life. It doesn't matter what their theology is, but whatever they think about God, that is how they live their life. If you're an atheist, if you're Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, certain branches of Christianity, however it is that you think about God, that is how you will live your life. Okay. And if you don't understand that ultimately God is good and ultimately has good character, you will take actions based off of that. And you I mean, right? You won't trust in God, and you won't trust in the things that he can do for you, and what he wants to you, and you won't trust in his goals for this life, and so you'll get bitter, resentful, and fearful about things. Jacob's prayer here, which I just stopped it in the middle of it. So in that way that this story is that there's this mapping on of Esau and God going on. So again, I'm just going to read this. The meaning of life is fellowship with God and man, meaning that the chief issue of life is how do you deal with God and man? The answer that this story provides to us is humbleness, which is a lowering of yourself, and an elevation of God. So both of those things are going to happen, and that starts with Jacob's prayer. Jacob prays. I think that this is the first really right and correct thing Jacob does in his life. While he is praying, what he's doing is he is understanding himself, the world, and God all at once. If theology dictates how we live our life, prayer is fundamentally what reorders our theology and gets us onto the right path. So whenever I say this is his first, obviously he did things right like before this, right? But what I mean like by really right is, I mean, it's the thing, like this prayer here is the thing that is, I think, is going to direct his path forward and is going to direct his life along the trajectory that it needs to go. And this prayer is what is going to lead him to the wrestling with God later. And if this prayer didn't happen, he wouldn't get to that wrestling later. In some ways, prayer is like walking. Trying to make an argument for why someone should walk is weird. Yes, it is possible to go through life while never walking. But it's so obviously better to walk than to not walk that sometimes we don't even realize why we should come up with reasons as to why it's better. If you have the means to not walk, everything is just brought to you, it's easy to conclude walking is pointless. It's just a thing people used to do in the past because they needed to. It's the same way that people treat prayer. Just a thing that people didn't understand the way that they didn't understand how to control the world, so they prayed. And the point is, yes, they didn't know how to understand the world. And you should take that point. You should take the point that you don't know how to understand the world. God does. And the world is a messy place and you need his help. And that's what I'm talking about. That's fundamentally what prayer does. And it becomes hard and becomes such a normal thing that we do in this Christian life that we don't really think about. Why should we tell people to pray? It's like, oh, well, we should pray because like you can get things. Like, yeah, you can get things. Like if you walk, you can walk and go get things, right? But that's not the real reason like why you do it. The real reason why you walk is because if you don't walk, you'll die. Like it's so fundamental. And yes, theoretically, right? All of us have seen WALL-E, right? You can imagine a world. You haven't seen WALL-E. It's not a good movie. People don't walk in it. Yeah.
Movie. You should watch it.
I like it. That's been more.
Right. But like my point is like it's so fundamental that we often don't think about it. But as soon as you put it in the right light, you realize it's like, okay, as soon as you stop doing that, you're living a wasted life. And I think it's the same way with prayer. Like if you're not praying in a proper way, or you're not praying at all, like you're you're not having a correct understanding of yourself and God and of the world. And so you're not oriented right, and you're going to have tons and tons of problems. And it's going to be like living in space, right? Whenever they're in space, they have to walk, right? They make themselves walk. They make themselves work out for, like, if you're on the ISS, you have to work out for 2 hours a day. Why? Because if you're not walking, you atrophy and you just start to crumble. And it's like, if you're not doing something that's so basic as praying, you're going to crumble. Okay. All right, let's keep going.
Staff, I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.
Okay, so again, just to highlight there that little bit. So he's scared of Esau. He's scared of the world. He's scared of the conditions that he's in, but he's trusting in God's character. Okay.
So he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp.
Okay, so that section. So it's a lot of animals, right?
It's a really big gift.
And
Yeah.
and one of the things that you should notice about the animals is, right, this level of division has continued all the way down even into the animals, right? And they're separated out. So this level of division of this of so he was two camps, and now he's separating out even more, right? Because as he's getting closer and closer to facing the reality of the thing that he's really scared for, it's causing more and more division, right? And so I'm going to even divide up my two camps even more and have them go a little bit at a time, right? I thought the ratio, so like I have nothing like for this, but I just thought the ratio of the male to female between a lot of the animals
Especially the goats.
was interesting.
It's 10-1 for the goats.
Well, it's 10-1 on the goats and 10-1 on the sheep,
Oh, this is-
right? Because you
Oh,
have
yeah.
the ewes to the rams. Then there's just 30 camels and their offspring listed, and it's like okay, we're not going to separate out those. But then you have 40-10 on the cows and the bulls, and you have 20-10 on donkeys. And it's interesting to me there's probably something to do with like clean versus unclean animals, because I think the only unclean animal there are the donkeys. I think even camels are considered clean, but I don't think donkeys are.
Maybe the camels are the odd ones out because they're just like the gift card you put on top of the big gift. It's like, oh, you know, here's a little extra.
Just a little extra, yeah. I mean, camels are expensive, man. Like,
Not to him.
I know the going price of camels is about $20K.
Things change.
So, how do I know that? Because I worked with an Arab dude once who told me that because he had to pay that much for a camel so that he could get married to his wife. And he spent the entire day talking to us about it because he wanted
the camel like to get to his marriage or for like dowry stuff.
for dowry stuff.
I like different.
The camel was his dowry, and he spent the whole day going. First of all, he was like amazed that I wasn't married, and then he kept forgetting that, and I was like, no, it was weird. And then he kept asking the one guy who was like my boss, who was like our manager. It was like my manager, me, and this other guy who were like going out on like this like trip to work on this like panel. And he kept asking him, he was like, so what did you get for like your wife's husband whenever you got married? And the guy laughed at him and he was like, nothing. I was like, I gave him a pat on the back and said, like, you're welcome. And he was like, really? And he was like, yeah. He was like, I didn't give him anything. And like, guy like couldn't believe it. But he's like, man, I had to work for 2 years to get $20,000 to buy a camel so that I could get married. We're all like, and I think he told him, he was like, don't tell anybody else at the office that. It's pretty funny. This was the Outbound, by the way.
Was it really?
Yeah, that guy doesn't work at Outbound anymore. I think he tried to bribe a cop so that he wouldn't get a speeding ticket, and like, no, he was confused by it. They were like the people at like the managers at like Outbound were trying to explain to him. He was like, they were like, you can't bribe cops. He was like, it wasn't a bribe. I was just trying to pay him so he didn't give me the ticket. We were like, that's a bribe. And he was like, we do that in my country all the time. And you can't do that here.
What do you call it? Oh, it's a bribe.
Yeah. So it was pretty funny. Anyways, that has nothing to do with this. Okay. So
Tell us more.
the present, okay, so the present, which is all of these gifts of the animals, will make Jacob see his face, right? And if you remember, this see his face in relationship to God is the equivalent of like having success, being blessed, right? And you have this like Nimrod was a great hunter before the face of the Lord and all of this stuff. And people being like, I want to have success with God. And it literally means I want to see his face. And so this same thing of, so, and the present there. So again, like if you have your step Bible open, you click present, it's same word for offering. So he is giving an offering in exchange for success. So this offering, this offering of a gift in exchange for success from the God is, if you read John Walton or like other people that like will give you a history lesson on Mesopotamian religions, but it's really pretty much all pagan religions work this way. It had this transactional nature to it, which is you give the offering and then you get something in return. And one of the big ongoing themes that's going to be in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is that is not the system by which Yahweh operates. He doesn't work like that. You can't just give him things and expect things in the back and expect things back. The reason why you give offerings to Yahweh is a completely different psychological and theological process. It's completely different from how people at the time were doing it. And that is the, like, one of the, in my opinion, is one of the major goals of the Old Testament, is to get the Israelites away from thinking how, away from how the other cultures at the time were thinking, and to the way that God wants them to think. That's the main goal. It does and it doesn't, actually. I would actually argue that there's a lot of ways in which it works very, very well. And actually, the whole reason why and I don't have time to get into this, but there's a whole relationship there between what I think God's goal is with the Old Testament and why actually he picked the Jews. And if you've heard me talk about this before, one of the things that God says about them, right?
Stubborn, like,
Their stubbornness, yeah, bullheaded. They're a stiff-necked people, right?
Stiff-necked.
And this aspect of them being a stiff-necked people, in my opinion, is the reason why they are picked as the chosen people, because he wants a stiff-necked people. Because there are times when you need to be like that, but it needs to
be for the right thing.
It needs to be for the right things, needs to be directed towards the right place, and needs to be accompanied by a soft heart that can, with discernment, apply the ethics of God where they need to be, which is what Jesus is coming in to do. The whole thing that Jesus is coming to do is to be like, you guys got a lot of things right? What he said, like, people always sleep on this verse. Jesus says, do what the Pharisees say to do, right? He tells them, do what the Pharisees say to do, but don't do as they do, right? And so you have this idea of like the way that they are thinking and conceiving about things and thinking about the law and the structure. A lot of that is correct, but their heart is not applying it correctly. And so you need to, and this is why whenever you get into Paul and everything, he starts talking about ethics of love and applying that into different situations, and why we now follow the law of love, which is the same as the law of Christ, and how that's differentiated from the law that's given in the Torah. And it's not that the law in the Torah is bad, it's that the law in the Torah is a tutor for the law of love. They work together. That also has nothing to do with this. But where was I? Oh, I want to talk a little bit about like the geography here. About because like they're going down, and I think they're eventually going to cross the Jordan, right? Because there's a lot of like this side of the Jordan. It's also going to mention the Jabbok in a bit. The Jabbok is a tributary of the Jordan, so it's like a part of the river that comes off of it. But okay, let's keep going.
The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone.
Okay.
That's such a great standout.
Yes, it is. Because that's why I'm like, you get to, this is why I'm like, this is the heart of like this story. And actually like this like you can already tell like from where we're at in the chapter, we're towards the end of the chapter, but we're gonna spend most of the rest of the time like just talking about this. That's what it comes down to, is that at a certain point, when all of the layers, right? Because we've been dealing with this of layers of family and clan and wives and material possessions and all of these layers. When you're really confronting God, all of those things get stripped away. And at the end, it's just you. And you have to deal with and confront God. And there's an argument to be made that because, right, so this is a story about returning to the land. There's an argument to be made that if you wanted to get into dispensationalist stuff, which blah, 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 people don't really like and everything, and there's good reasons for that. But in my opinion, I think the best descriptor for like kind of the time frame that we're living in post-Christ is this. It's the idea of the kingdom. What people will talk about is the already but not yet. The kingdom of God is at hand, but the kingdom of God is also in the future. this entire time frame that we're living in is this liminal space between the cross where it is finished, everything is supposed to be done, but yet we're not there yet. And when we get there, when we get to the promised land, that is the return to land, that is heaven, that is the eschaton, right? So we are living in this space right now where we are constantly kind of doing this, where we're constantly kind of going back into the land. And it makes all of us kind of realize at the end of the day, actually, we're on our own. But what we're going to, and that is sobering, but also very depressing. But once you realize is that if you're doing it properly and you are attempting to make that connection with God, it's all going to come back. And most of that all going to come back, we're going to talk about next week because that's whenever the resolution to the story happens. But that's what we're building up to. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why do you think he did this?
Did
So
what?
it's weird that he sent like everybody over and then just decided like I'm gonna stay here by myself. Like, do you think there's some reason why he did it, or do you think he felt like just led by God to do it?
No, he's terrified. He's really scared.
He's
So
kind of
he's a coward.
defenseless.
Yes,
He sent his wife or his wives and children ahead of him.
yes, he's scared. There's a way in which you could frame it in that perhaps he's you could frame it in a religious way too if you wanted to, of saying like, well, he knows that he's supposed to be blessed. He knows that he's supposed to have all of these reassurances from God, but he has this, and he like, right, we just talked about how like the prayer was like the right thing to do, and like he's doing like the right thing. But he's coming up hard against the real world right now. And that is the issue of him being like, okay. So Brooke preached for like 5 minutes last week, but she used one of the best illustrations that I think I've seen anybody use in a really long time, where
Sunday or Wednesday?
Wednesday, where she had one of the students not be able, blindfolded, and not be able to see that she had put a chair behind her. And then she told her to sit down. And the first time that the student went to sit down, she was like really hesitant and really like trepid. But after she sat down the first time, Brooke was like, okay, stand up, sit down again. And she's like, and she got up and she did it again. And she's like, and then she told her like 20 more times, and she got up and did it. And she's like, okay. By the end of that, you were going really fast and doing it like that. But the first time you went really, really slow. That's what Jacob's doing right here. This is the first time where like Jacob was like scared at points before, right? And what did Jacob do whenever he was scared? He ran away. Right? He ran away from Esau. Whenever he got scared of Laban, he ran away from Laban, right? He runs away whenever he gets scared. He's now running to the danger. And he's now like, I have to embrace, not only am I running to the danger, I'm going to embrace the danger. He's terrified of it. Like, that's what he's doing here. So, like, is he a coward? Yes. Justifiably so. Maybe he thinks that you could argue that maybe thinks he's doing the right thing because the promise is supposed to come through him. So maybe if he lives, it can come about some other way, blah, 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 blah. You could argue that, but I think that's just fluff. I think what it really is he's just legitimately terrified.
Kind of just trying to secure that promise as much.
Yeah, as much as he can and secure his own safety. He is like right now, he is trying to secure his own safety as much as he can. But yeah.
Which is funny, like if you look at it, it's like he's trying to secure God's promise his own way.
Yes.
He's seeing God flourish in his life, and surely he'd think, well, God promised me this, so I don't have to try to go out of my way to secure that. He's gonna go and secure that for me. But he doesn't,
Right.
as we all.
I'd say it's almost more of this is the first time he's actually leaning on God's control on the situation, and he's terrified because he's never actually fully put that trust in.
Yes.
Man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh.
Okay. So that last little portion is like, it's so short, like from 25 to like 32, but like it's crazy how much stuff is there. Jacob is called Jacob because he held on to Esau's heel, right? He's now holding on to God. During their fight, God cheats. I talk about this a lot because I think that this is incredibly significant. Many things that happen in this life are not fair. There's far too much evil, there's far too much suffering, and there's seemingly little that is done about it. But God cheats. If you take those criticisms and try to say that it is unfair, and therefore God isn't real, or he isn't there, or he isn't good, then guess what? None of those problems, the evil, the suffering, the fact that nothing's done about it, they don't go away. You just lose God, who was the solution to those problems. But further, you come to a bigger issue then if you lose God. Why is there any good? If there is no God and he is evil, then there would be no good. And since there is good, there must be God. You can't get rid of him. He cheats. All you can do is trust in his goodness. And so one of the things, and this is why I think that a lot of, right, I mean, we talked about this at young adults like a long time ago, right? About like, well, not long, it was like a couple months ago, about how it's like, yeah, there's terrible things that happen. Like, think about Andrew and like his wife and like in relationship to his kids. Like the fact that his wife died at such a young age is not fair. Like, it's not fair. Like, he got his wife taken away. Those 4 kids had their mom taken away. It's not fair. But using that as a weapon against God, you know what? It might even be effective. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work because the only solution that Andrew or his kids or that family has is to trust in God and to trust that that situation is going to be redeemed. And God does that. And that to me is, again, like many of these things, that's the thing that's ultimately going to get fulfilled in Christ, right? Christ lets his friends die. He lets Lazarus die. Why does he do that? Because he does that all the time. He lets his friends die. Why? Because the goal is not this, the goal is not comfort in this present existence. The goal is existence in eternity forever. And he has a plan for how he's going to get there. And what we've been talking about in Genesis is him working out that plan. And legitimate criticisms about your station and about what's happened to you, like, they're going to be legitimate. Job's criticisms of God are legitimate. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter, because the only person that can solve Job's issues and that can bring about restoration, and that actually cares about Job, is God. And so Job needs to get his head on straight, which is why God comes in at the end of Job and like kind of smacks Job around a little bit and is like, you need to get your head on straight and realize the position that I'm in. Like, your comfort is not the goal. It's a thing that God cares about. God cares about your comfort. God cares about your pain. He cares about the things that's wrong in the world. If he didn't, Jesus never would have come, right? And Jesus wouldn't have made the point of trying to identify with us. He does identify with us, but he identifies with us to get us, to help us to understand that that is not like, right? Like, that is not the goal, right? He brings Lazarus back to life, but Lazarus still dies. Okay, because that's not the real miracle. The real miracle comes at the end, right? And so, like, whenever he defeats death, and so he cheats. So in the same way that he cheats in this fight, he's going to cheat and beat death. Why? Because he can, because he's powerful enough to do it. And the fact that he's powerful enough to do it and that he has a good character are the things that we need to trust in him with, right? So in the same way that he wasn't trusting in like Esau's strength and character, we need to trust in God's strength and character. So all right, we're gonna move on from that. The angel links, right? Because he says, I will not leave until you bless me. Jacob already has Esau's blessing and birthright, right? He stole them from Esau. Jacob has numerous wives. He has numerous kids. He has lots of stuff. But yet also he has nothing. He asks to be blessed. The angel links the blessing with Jacob's name, right? He doesn't say like, oh, here's a blessing. The response to I need to be blessed is, I'm giving you a name change. And when he gives him that name change, he's giving him a new identity, right? And if you've been paying attention, because we've been harping on it a lot, there's been a running theme about murky and questionable identity throughout this whole story, about this whole, like, all the stories that we keep coming up with, right? Yeah, the struggle between names, the struggle between identity, all of that. And what's happening here is God is fulfilling that, and specifically Christ, because, right? I'll get to more stuff about Christ in a bit. that change of identity and that change of name is the same thing that happens with us because of what Christ did. Striven with God and prevailed. How has Jacob prevailed? He has lost in this fight. He has lost this fight against God, right? Because it's you have striven with God and men and prevailed. He's lost this fight, and he's still subject to his brother. But he's prevailed in that he's prevailed because, so this is again my opinion. He's prevailed because he's gone to God. Because he didn't. So there's a lot, and we'll get to talk about more of this in a bit. The idea about moving away versus moving toward. And Jacob doesn't run away from God, he runs toward God. That idea is going to get kind of reversed a little bit in a story that we're going to talk about with Christ here in a second. But the reason why he has prevailed is because he tried. Because he went to God, that is why he prevailed. He brought his complaints to God. That's why he prevailed. He prevailed because he did those things. There's also ambiguity in the name itself of Israel, right? So Israel means one of two things. It's either he who struggles with God. So the word struggle, like you can find it if you click on it in the Step Bible. It's like close to like Sarah and then El, and so you kind of like mash them together a little bit, and it becomes like Sarah El, and so that's where you get the kind of Yisrael. It's like murky or whatever, but like the etymology is like there and everything. But I think it probably means both of those things at the same time, right? It's he who struggles with, and especially if you look at the story, he struggles with God and prevails, right? Man does, and yet God still wins. So which name does Israel mean? Does it mean he who struggles with God, or does it mean God rules? It means both, because both things happen in the story, right? Other interesting thing that happens in this. The angel does not tell him his name, right? Jacob asks, "What is your name?" And he doesn't tell him. Why doesn't he tell him? In my opinion, this is a fourth wall break. Okay? Because who are the people that are originally reading this? Israel. It's Israel. Israel's just been named in the story. And they're coming back and going, and the first Israel's going, "What's your name?" It's a fourth wall break. Not going to answer that. Why? Because the person that's reading it knows what his name is. Because they found out his name from Moses, right? That's whenever he answers it. That's whenever he answers that question. And so that time gap there, and what most people are going to end up, most like theologians and stuff are going to call like progressive revelation or whatever. God's not upset or like God, like to me, this is the most clear indication of like God utilizing progressive revelation. He doesn't give everybody everything all at once because he's recognizing that there's a story that he's making here. He's like trying to get all of you guys on the same page, and he's treating. It's the same thing of like he's treating them as like a collective whole, but also as an individual, right? And so you have that same idea of collective whole versus individual thing that I was talking about earlier. Quick differentiation. I think I've mentioned this tons of times to people about the differentiation between Israel and Islam. Islam means submission, and Israel, as we just talked about, means he struggles with God. So the idea of struggling versus submission. The key difference between key difference between struggle and submission is proximity. You can submit to somebody from anywhere. You can only struggle with somebody while you're close to them. You can't struggle with them from far away. You have to get close to them to struggle. Okay, so one of the other things that I wanted to do is draw a connection between this story and the story about the road to Emmaus. Okay, so the road to Emmaus is the post-resurrection story where you have two disciples, two unnamed disciples, not of the 12, leave Jerusalem, are walking to Emmaus, and they meet a man. They meet a man there. They start telling him about Jesus. They start coaching him on Jesus. He starts talking to them about the scriptures. They go in, they have a meeting. Once he breaks the bread, they realize he disappears and they realize who he is, right? So you have the same pattern of the doubt leads to separation, and you move away. Leads to separation. That doubt leads to encounter with a man who you don't know. You struggle with them. The road to Emmaus is not a physical struggle, right? It's just arguing about scriptures. That struggle leads to a revelation of God, that you realize who God is. You realize that was him all along. And then that leads you back, because what happens at the end of that story is that those disciples go back to Jerusalem and tell the disciples, and arguably at that point are kind of better disciples because they've encountered the risen Christ, and you should recognize how important encountering the risen Christ is to the early Christians, because that's the thing that Paul flexes on everybody, like in his letters and everything, right? And you've encountered God, and that encountering of God leads you back to the center of the land. All right. That pattern is the same of what's going right. It like should be obvious, right? You all see that connection between that pattern of the road to Emmaus is the same as what's going on here in with Jacob. And part of the reason why I like this is, and why I think it's so significant, is because it's one of the key areas where I think that the modern church has failed. The modern church has not adequately dealt with the doubts of individuals. And we've gotten people to think that if they doubt, that is a problem. And the argument that I want to make to you guys is that the core of what the Bible is talking about. And so to me, if anybody has that kind of idea, to me, whenever I hear anybody kind of saying anything like that, the first thing I think is, oh, you just haven't read the Bible. Like you just don't know what it is. Because fundamentally what the Bible is a story about how, no, really, you need to take those doubts and struggle with them, and they will actually lead you closer to God than anything else that you can do. Mere following of rules, mere blinding yourself to your own inner being and how you're feeling, all of those things are going to fail. You need to expose yourself to God, right? And I kind of mean that in like like an actual like weird way of like linking exposed to like being naked, right? Because that's the whole point of them being naked in the garden, right? You need to get into a situation like that with God. And when you do that, that's like that's the point of this life. That's actually like that's going to be the key to you living your life is doing that act because that's Eden, that's presence of God, that's the fulfillment of the meaning of life. And once you've done that, you can then take that and do all of the things that God wants you to do. And until you've done that, until you've laid yourself bare before God, you're not. You're going to be going through the motions. Like I would argue that like up until this point, Jacob is largely going through the motions. He's doing some things good. He's trying some good things out here and there. But really, until you get to that point, you're not serving God like with everything that you are, with your full capacity. And if you're not at that point yet or haven't gone through that kind of experience with God, you're smacking up in the face of reality at some point is going to get you there, right? When you face the real hard things in this life, that's going to get you there and force you into a place where you have to confront God. Does that make sense? The last thing that I just wanted to say is it ends with this weird little part about to this day they don't eat this portion of the sinew of the thigh of the meat where God touched Jacob. That's obviously like a weird little like thing at the end, and you're like, okay, well, what do we do? Well, you have this nice little memorial thing, blah blah blah. I think the symbolism of this should be kind of obvious. They leave this side connection point that governs how the creature walks. They leave that alone. They don't touch that, right? And to me, like, and that is symbolic of like, right? Because Jacob walks away from this with a limp, right? And if you think about what I talked about earlier about like the connection between walking and like prayer, right? And being like, okay, and we even talk about this like right with Enoch, right? Like Enoch walked with the Lord, right? We have this idea that they're fundamentally like linked. You leave that bit. You got to make sure that that bit is left alone, and like don't mess with the connection point. And so like you got to try and get back to that connection point. And sometimes, and so this is where I was going to talk about the difference between the center and the side. There are times where that connection point is at the center, right? And so you got to like go towards God. But then there's sometimes where even whenever you're running away from God, you're running away from the center, you're running away from Jerusalem, you've made your bed in the pit of Sheol, even God finds you there. And you can still connect with God there. And so even whenever you're doing things wrong, and this is what, you know, as Christians, like we hope and pray for the groups and for the people that are not going towards God like we think that they should, even in those side areas as they go off to, you know, do things that they're not supposed to be doing, right? And actually even like the best example of this, I think Rachel talked about on Sunday, right? They sent Nate away, right? They sent Nate away. And it was in that place where he was not around a godly presence that he connected with God. and that brought him back to God. And so there's ambiguity there that I could talk a lot more about, but we're already over the hour mark. So I guess any comments, questions, anything that anybody wants to say about what we talked about today?
It was really helpful.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll stop the recording there.